Ethan Crowley had lived in Ashwood Glen for less than 6 weeks when the first envelope slid into his mailbox. He almost tossed it aside with the grocery flyers and local pizza coupons. But something about the bold, blocky type on the front made him pause. Inside, on a single sheet of paper, the letter read like a citation more than a notice. Violation, non-compliant porch color. Fine, $50. He read it twice. He hadn't chosen anything outrageous, just a deep navy blue that reminded his wife of the coastal towns they used to visit. Shrugging, he set it aside and figured a phone call would clear things up. But before he could even dial the number printed at the bottom, another envelope arrived the very next day. This time it was about the mailbox. The paint was chipped, another $25. Then a third letter followed in trimmed hedge. Then a fourth, unauthorized lawn ornament. Ethan looked out at the small bronze frog his daughter had placed near the walkway and wondered if someone had sat watching, waiting to pounce. At first, he laughed it off. But after the 5th notice, Ethan stopped laughing. He called the HOA's listed number, only to be transferred, brushed off, or told to read the community regulations more closely. The rules were dense, vague in some places, absurdly specific in others. His neighbor across the street, an elderly man who waved from a squeaky rocker every evening, gave him a tired smile and said, "You're not the first. You won't be the last." Ethan started keeping a folder. He labeled it, Ashwood HOA Disputes. By the end of the month, it was thicker than his homeowner's insurance policy. He noticed patterns. The letters always arrived at 8:45 a.m., and always in the same envelope. The fines, oddly precise. $37 for edge encroachment. $18 for a garden light exceeding brightness limits. It felt less like regulation, and more like harassment. Still, he didn't lash out. He mowed the lawn on schedule, trimmed the hedge to regulation height, removed the frog. But the fines didn't stop. Instead, they evolved, now citing attitude during compliance, and failure to correct tone in email replies. Ethan felt the pressure building, but outwardly he remained calm. Then, one evening, just before dusk, he saw him, the man, with the clipboard. Middle-aged, gray suit, moving briskly down the sidewalk with a camera and a tape measure. He walked past the houses quickly, then slowed conspicuously in front of Ethan's driveway, making notes and snapping pictures. Their eyes met. The man smiled faintly, then turned and left without a word. That night, Ethan walked his neighborhood, talking to whoever would open their door. At first, people were reluctant, almost afraid. But when he shared the stack of fine notices he'd received, a few faces lit up with recognition. "You too," one woman whispered. "They fined me for having a sunflower wreath." A man chimed in. "I had to repaint my door twice." By the end of the walk, Ethan had counted 7 similar stories. Some had been dealing with it for years. One had tried to leave but couldn't sell because the HOA demanded $8,000 in exit fees. Something about it wasn't adding up. The rules weren't just strict. They were being used, weaponized. He could feel it, like an itch behind the walls. Later, as he sat under the porch light the HOA had just fined him for replacing with a warmer bulb, Ethan stared across the lawn. The clipboard man had returned, this time standing in front of another home, snapping pictures again. It was the 3rd house this week. Ethan leaned back in his chair. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just watched on. In that quiet moment, something shifted. He wasn't going to fight the fines. He was going to understand them, then he was going to burn the whole rotten system down from the inside. Ethan woke the next morning to a new envelope resting against his door, delivered early, not by mail but by hand. The same block print. The same signature. This time, it cited a failure to maintain uniform shrub height, and came with a $32 fine. His shrubs hadn't grown a single inch since yesterday. The envelope was still cool with dew when he laid it on his kitchen table beside a now-growing stack. He didn't need coffee anymore to feel his pulse jump. The HOA wasn't letting up. It was circling. At work, Ethan spent the morning combing through the HOA bylaws again. Line after line of vague language and ambiguous expectations. But something caught his attention this time, a clause about financial disclosures. According to the bylaw, any resident could request a detailed financial report, including board compensation and budget allocations. By submitting a written request, he printed the clause and folded it carefully into a letter. That night, he walked down to the HOA Dropbox near the community center and slipped it inside. He didn't expect a response. He expected silence. Instead, what he got was worse, an escalation. 2 days later, he received 3 envelopes in a single delivery. One for trash bins visible from the street, though pickup was still hours away. Another for aggressive posture toward HOA enforcement personnel. He remembered standing on his own porch, arms crossed, watching the clipboard man. The third one made him stop breathing for a second. Harassment of HOA officers. Threatening behavior. Recorded incident. He flipped the page. There was no video, no transcript, just a declaration, a signature, and a warning that further disturbances could result in a formal hearing and temporary suspension of community privileges. Ethan placed it slowly on the table. The game had changed. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he built a list: names, addresses, any neighbors who had mentioned fines, grievances, or strange visits. By morning, there were 17. He called 3 before sunrise. All 3 answered. All 3 agreed to meet. At the small local cafe on the corner of Ashwood and Brookstone, he sat with a group of neighbors. Some had been there for years. Some new like him, but all of them carried the same fatigue in their faces. They exchanged stories. A woman had been fined for a wind chime. A man for unauthorized mailbox font. Someone else for planting lavender that attracted too many bees. Then, someone lowered their voice and mentioned the name of the HOA president, Carlton Delaney. He'd been president for 6 years, re-elected without contest every time. No one could recall ever seeing him campaign. One woman claimed she tried to run once but was disqualified for missing a single HOA dues payment by 12 hours. And there was more. The HOA had outsourced several enforcement tasks to a company called Trimark Property Solutions. No one in the group had ever heard of it. Ethan wrote it down. The group agreed to form a quiet alliance. Ethan called it the Folder Club. Every fine, every interaction, every suspicious moment copied, printed, and stored. Later that week, Ethan received a manila package. No return address. Inside was a thick printout of documents, some official, some scribbled by hand. At the top was a yellow sticky note with a single sentence: follow the reimbursements. He flipped through pages. There were names, figures, payments labeled as security audits and consulting fees. Most of them went to the same place: Trimark. And at the bottom of one sheet, written faintly in the corner in pencil, were 4 words that made Ethan sit straight up. Carlton Delaney owns Trimark. Ethan stared at the penciled words for a long while, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. The note hadn't been signed. There was no sender. But someone knew more than they were willing to say aloud. And that someone had just handed him the key to a hidden door. He didn't waste time. That weekend, he walked down to the community center during the posted open hours. The HOA office sat in a squat, windowless room at the back of the building. An elderly volunteer behind the desk greeted him with a plastic smile. When he asked for the latest annual budget and board compensation records, she blinked twice, then hesitated. "I'm not sure we usually give that out, it's in the bylaws," he said calmly, tapping the folded paper he brought with the exact clause. Page 12. Third paragraph. After a pause, she disappeared into a file cabinet and returned with a stapled packet of papers. Ethan thanked her and walked out without opening it. Not until he reached home, sat at the dining table, and turned on the lamp did he begin to dissect the details. The report was dry at first: standard allocations for landscaping, security patrols, community maintenance, but then he spotted it. Consulting services, $148,000. The pay listed Trimark Property Solutions. In a neighborhood with only 122 homes, a second line made his hand stop mid. Legal advisory and compliance monitoring, $62,5. Same pay. Other entries were more vague: HOA oversight, policy development, and one simply marked enforcement fieldwork. All linked to Trimark. No contact number, no physical address, just the company name and a P.O. box. The same P.O. box. The fines were postmarked from. Ethan cross-referenced the total payments with what he could find online. He couldn't locate a website. No phone listings. No official records in the county business database. But a deeper search pulled something up: an old registration from 7 years ago. Registered agent, Carlton Delaney. He leaned back in his chair. It was a funnel. The fines weren't just petty punishments. They were revenue streams collected from the residents, funneled through the HOA, and paid to Delaney's own shell company, under the guise of contracted services. The next morning, Ethan visited 2 more neighbors. One had lived in Ashwood Glen for nearly 15 years. The other had once served briefly on the board but resigned after being shut out of financial discussions. Neither knew the full extent of what Ethan was uncovering. When he shared it with them, both agreed to help dig further. They divided tasks. Ethan continued collecting documents. One neighbor called old board members, trying to find anyone who might have tried to stop Delaney in the past. Another worked on identifying who still attended board meetings and who had quietly drifted away. Meanwhile, the fines kept coming. But now, Ethan welcomed them. Each envelope was another piece of evidence. He filed them carefully, photographed them, time-stamped them. He even installed a small camera on his porch, angled just enough to catch the delivery man who turned out to be the same clipboard stranger from weeks ago, Trimark's enforcement officer. The final piece came during a rainy evening when a nervous knock rattled Ethan's door. He opened it to find a man in his 40s, holding a crumpled binder under a jacket. He didn't introduce himself. He just looked around once, then handed the binder over. "Used to work for Trimark," he muttered. "Didn't like what I saw. I'm done now. That folder. That's what he doesn't want anyone seeing." He disappeared into the night. Ethan opened the binder. Inside were internal memos, fake invoice templates, and a list of residents labeled by enforcement urgency. His name was at the top marked in red. Ethan stared at the list until the streetlights flickered off. His name wasn't just first, it was flagged with instructions: persistent high risk, observe closely. It wasn't about violations anymore. He'd become a target. And if Delaney was willing to classify neighbors like assets in a game, then it was time to flip the board. The binder held more than notes. It contained a copy of a long-forgotten amendment buried in the HOA's charter. It outlined the power of proxy votes, a rule that allowed any homeowner to assign their vote to another resident in matters of board elections. So long as it was written and signed, Delaney had stayed in power through silence. Few showed up to vote. Most had lost faith. That silence had been his shield. But now Ethan saw it for what it was, a crack wide enough to drive a stake through. He started quietly. He printed out blank proxy forms and kept them tucked behind his phone case. Each morning, he walked the neighborhood not as a homeowner, but as a listener. He asked about trash pickup. He complimented lawns. He stopped to help an elderly woman replace a porch bulb. One by one, doors opened. Words followed. Frustration poured out. They weren't just angry about fines. They were tired of being watched, judged, written up for things they hadn't done or couldn't fix fast enough. One woman cried when she admitted she stopped inviting her grandchildren over because their sidewalk chalk once triggered a $90 violation. Ethan didn't pressure. He simply listened. And at the right moment, he offered them a way out: assigned proxy, letting him vote on their behalf. He explained the process. Explained the numbers. They didn't need a revolution, just a quorum. The signatures came slowly at first, then faster. A man with a torn screen door signed after Ethan brought him a replacement and helped him fix it. A young couple signed after Ethan showed them their HOA dues had quietly increased twice in 1 year with no explanation. A retired schoolteacher who had stopped attending meetings signed 3 after remembering the fines she'd once paid for hanging bird feeders. Ethan stored the signed proxies in a locked filing box under his bed. Every evening, he counted them, like they were lottery tickets. By week's end, he had 17. By the next, 20-6. On the outside, he said nothing. He still mowed his lawn to code, still got fined for window blinds appearing discolored from the street. But inside, the machine was turning. The silence Delaney had counted on was cracking apart. Then came the letter. Official HOA, letterhead. But this one wasn't a fine. It was an announcement. The annual board election would take place in 3 weeks. 1 open seat. Members eligible to run must notify the board within 7 days. Ethan didn't hesitate. He submitted his intent to run the same day. He left the form in the drop box and watched from a distance as the envelope was picked up 20 minutes later by the same clipboard man. That night, his porch light was shattered. No camera caught it. No one admitted to hearing a thing. But when Ethan picked up the broken glass with his gloved hands, he did it with a quiet calm. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't rattled because 32 proxies sat in his locked box now. 32 voices. And for the first time in years, Ashwood Glen wasn't silent anymore. Election night arrived under a heavy sky, the air still and thick as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. The community center lights blazed unnaturally bright, the small parking lot unusually full. For years, elections passed like a formality. 24 chairs set out, barely half of them filled. This time, every seat was taken. Ethan walked in without speaking. In his bag were the signed proxy forms, carefully ordered and sealed. He nodded at the neighbors he recognized, many of whom avoided eye contact, unsure if the room had eyes. At the front sat the board, 5 figures behind a folding table, led by Carlton Delaney in his signature charcoal gray suit. Delaney didn't smile. He barely looked at Ethan. The meeting began with rote introductions, a reading of bylaws, and a quick recap of the year's achievements. But as Delaney moved to open the floor for nominations, Ethan stood up, walking to the microphone set at the center of the room. "My name is Ethan Crowley. I submitted my candidacy within the required time and per section 4.2 of the HOA charter. I am also submitting 38 proxy votes from eligible residents of Ashwood Glen." He placed the sealed envelope on the table with quiet finality. The room stirred. Delaney's hand hesitated mid-motion. He leaned toward the board's attorney, whispering something. The attorney opened the envelope, began counting. Delaney spoke, his voice strained but controlled. "These will require verification. Some may not be valid. Homeowners can't be coerced." "No one was," Ethan interrupted. "And if any homeowner in this room believes their vote was misused, they're free to speak now." Silence. A slow moment passed as the attorney completed his tally, flipping the forms with care. He leaned toward the microphone. "The proxies are in order. 38 total. Mr. Crowley meets the requirements for candidacy and holds the majority of eligible votes for the open board seat." The room erupted into hushed murmurs. Delaney's face tightened. He looked like a man watching something slip from his fingers and realizing too late he had no way to stop it. Ethan took a seat near the front. He said nothing else. He didn't have to. The vote was called. Paper ballots for show, though the outcome was already sealed. Residents lined up, many smiling faintly. Some looked terrified of being seen. But they voted. The count took less than 10 minutes. When it was done, the results were clear: Ethan Crowley by a landslide. The moment the announcement was made, Delaney stood and gathered his papers. He didn't congratulate, he didn't shake hands. He whispered something to the clipboard man, near the back, then walked out the side door, disappearing into the night. Ethan didn't celebrate. He didn't raise his hands or thank the crowd. He waited. Only when the room began to thin did he walk to the board's table and speak quietly to the remaining members. "I'd like to motion for a full audit of Trimark Property Solutions and any HOA funds allocated to it over the last 7 years. Effective immediately." No one opposed him. The next day, Ethan arrived at the office with 2 neighbors and a box of records. He had legal counsel, a hired accountant, and a document scanner ready. Everything Delaney had hidden behind jargon and empty meetings was now being dragged into the light. By dusk, Ethan found the paper trail: padded invoices, split contracts, false signatures. Trimark had siphoned tens of thousands annually, and Delaney's name appeared in every corner of the mess. The clipboard man didn't return that week, but something else did. An anonymous note shoved through Ethan's mail slot. No envelope, no signature, just one sentence: "Delaney doesn't let go quietly." By the time the full audit report reached Ethan's hands, the numbers confirmed what the whispers had long suggested. Delaney hadn't just run the HOA, he'd mined it. Funds meant for community repairs had vanished into vague expenses. Landscaping fees were doubled and redirected to shell vendors. Ethan traced it all, page by page, late into the night, the soft scratch of his pen marking every entry that led back to Trimark. He didn't call the police. Not yet. He had a plan, and it wasn't finished. The next board meeting was the most attended in Ashwood Glen history. More than 80 residents packed the community center, many standing along the walls. Ethan opened the session with the audit findings. He didn't raise his voice. He let the facts speak. One resident covered her mouth as the numbers were read aloud. Another asked, barely above a whisper, how much of their dues were left. Ethan answered everything. He called a vote to suspend all HOA dealings with Trimark immediately. It passed unanimously. Then another vote to remove any sitting board members who had signed off on unexplained transactions. That too passed, clearing out 2 more seats. By the end of the evening, only Ethan and 1 quiet board member remained. And for the first time in years, the residents clapped. The next weeks moved like a cleansing wind. Ethan created a public finance board, open for any resident to join. A group of volunteers cataloged every remaining invoice, cross-checked payment histories, and began processing refund claims for illegitimate fines. Fences once flagged for unauthorized height were reapproved. Residents who had been hounded for tiny details, door colors, wind chimes, flower types were invited to voice their complaints and suggest fair revisions to the community. Code Ethan didn't just change the rules, he restructured who got to write them. But as the neighborhood's pulse steadied, his own thoughts grew more watchful. 3 times he spotted a dark sedan parked just beyond the cul-de-sac, always engine, idling, never staying long enough to catch. One night, he found his trash bins overturned and the word traitor scratched faintly into his mailbox. No cameras caught it. No witnesses. He took it in quietly. The warning note hadn't been idle talk. A week later, as the board prepared to submit the audit to the county for formal investigation, a letter arrived for Ethan's stamp, just tucked into his doorframe. Inside were 2 pages of old court records, dismissed lawsuits, quiet settlements, non-disclosure agreements, all of them tied to Trimark. All of them ended before ever reaching trial. The message was clear. Delaney had dealt with threats before. He had ways of disappearing problems. Ethan considered his options. He could hand everything to law enforcement and walk away. Let them dig. Let the system handle it. But he didn't trust the silence that had protected Delaney for so long. Instead, he sent one letter of his own. It was addressed not to the police or a legal office, but to every single homeowner in Ashwood Glen. A plain envelope, a single-page letter. It listed Delaney's connections, the fraudulent companies, the money trail, and the vote that had overthrown him. At the bottom, Ethan added one sentence: "This is your neighborhood now. Don't let anyone take it again." The night the letters were delivered, the porch light flickered twice, then the power cut out entirely. In the dark, Ethan sat quietly, listening. Outside, a car door shut. The knock came slow and firm, not rushed, not hesitant. Ethan opened the door to find 2 uniformed deputies and a man in a pressed gray suit, holding a folder against his chest. The deputy handed over the papers. Civil litigation. Carlton Delaney was suing Ethan Crowley for defamation, unlawful removal from office, and procedural violations in the board election. Ethan read the first paragraph in silence. Delaney wasn't coming back with fines. He was coming with lawyers. The court date was set for 10 days out. The neighborhood felt it immediately. Porch conversations stopped when Ethan walked by. Some windows stayed shut that used to wave. Doubt crept back in. Fear returned like a memory people thought they had forgotten. That's how Delaney had ruled before, by never raising his voice, only the cost. Ethan didn't panic. He went to work. He met with the few board members who hadn't resigned in fear. They agreed to back him publicly, submitting signed affidavits about the audit process and the proxies. The finance volunteers submitted logs and timestamped documents. The former Trimark employee, the one who left the binder, was tracked down. He agreed to speak under subpoena, as long as his identity remained sealed until trial. Legal team filed 3 motions in a single day, one to suppress the audit, another to bar proxy voting records, and a third demanding Ethan's removal from the board while the case remained active. All 3 were denied by the court. Still, Ethan didn't relax. He knew Delaney wasn't fighting for truth, he was fighting to drag the fight itself out long enough to make people forget why they were angry. The night before the hearing, someone left a single page on Ethan's porch. A printout of an HOA bylaw one Ethan knew well, but this version had been altered. It claimed that proxy votes must be notarized. His weren't. He took it as a message. If Delaney couldn't beat him in court, he'd try to drown him in technicalities. The courtroom wasn't packed, but it wasn't empty. A few neighbors came. A local reporter showed up late. Delaney sat, confidently in a navy suit, expression unreadable. Ethan stood with a small folder and no legal team, just the truth, and the paper trail he'd built one sleepless night at a time. Delaney's lawyer argued that Ethan had manipulated residents into signing votes without proper disclosure, that he had faked charges of corruption to gain power, that the audit was incomplete, the accounting unverifiable, and the board had been turned into a personal weapon. Then Ethan stepped forward. He handed the judge a flash drive. It contained security footage from a neighbor's door, the clipboard man slipping fines into mailboxes, even for homes without violations. He presented pages of invoices, all linked to Trimark, each signed by Delaney. Finally, he submitted a sworn statement from the former Trimark employee detailing how the company was a deliberate funnel for HOA funds. The judge called for recess. When the court resumed, Delaney's lawyer seemed, smaller, quieter, less. Convinced, the judge delivered the ruling at 3:42 p.m. Ethan had acted within the HOA charter. The audit findings were valid. The election results stood. The defamation claim was baseless. As Delaney rose from his seat to leave, Ethan turned just slightly. Their eyes met only for a second. Delaney gave a slight nod, whether in respect or warning, Ethan couldn't tell. But when the court clerk handed him the stamped dismissal, Ethan noticed something tucked behind it. An anonymous envelope. Inside was a photograph. A zoomed-in image of Ethan's daughter walking home from school. No message, no name. Just the image. Ethan stared at the photograph for a long time after the courtroom emptied. The image was grainy, shot from a distance, but there was no mistake. His daughter, backpack slung across one shoulder, head down, walking the sidewalk that led to their house. No other people, no caption, just a quiet threat wrapped in a memory. He didn't show the photo to his wife. He made no police report. He simply went home, checked the locks twice, and activated every spare camera he had stored in the garage. By morning, the image had been placed in a sealed box along with the rest of the Trimark documents, because if Delaney had left the court with nothing else, he'd still walked away with a message. But so had Ethan. The next board meeting was held outdoors. On the lawn outside the community center, folding chairs formed a wide ring. There were no suits, no gavel, just neighbors, real ones who brought their dogs, their kids, and their voices. Ethan stood in the middle with a clipboard, not as a leader giving orders, but as a neighbor, asking questions. They voted on amendments, stripping the board of unchecked enforcement authority, capping fines, eliminating third-party contractors without resident approval. Lawn ornaments were legalized. Porch paint options expanded. And for the first time in memory, the rulebook became something the community could actually read without a lawyer. But something bigger happened. One by one, residents stepped forward with stories. Some long-buried harassments, threats, fees for things they hadn't known were rules. A retired woman brought a folder full of fines from 5 years ago, all connected to an anonymous noise complaint during the week she'd hosted her dying sister. Another spoke of surveillance, of her son being followed on his bike by a Trimarked car. Ethan listened. Every story was written down. And before the meeting ended, the HOA board, now composed entirely of elected residents, voted to file a class action suit on behalf of the community against Carlton, Delaney, and Trimark Property Solutions. They didn't expect to win everything, but they expected the truth to see daylight. Weeks passed. The fine letters stopped. The clipboard man disappeared entirely. Delaney's house sat dark, his mailbox stuffed with uncollected mail. Eventually, a for sale sign appeared on his front lawn, but no one ever saw him leave. Life returned to Ashwood Glen in odd, beautiful ways. A neighbor painted his garage door bright orange. A child built a gnome village on his front steps. Someone installed a small windmill that squeaked delightfully in the breeze. No one complained. One morning, Ethan stepped outside to find something new in his own front yard. A handmade wooden sign staked into the ground, painted with uneven white letters, HOA headquarters. Now under human management, he smiled, looked up and down the street. No one claimed it, but he left it there anyway. That night, he checked his porch cameras one last time. No strange cars, no envelopes. No envelopes. The system that had once stalked every inch of their lives had fallen, not with shouts, but with slow, steady footsteps, and the neighborhood it left behind had finally learned to speak for itself, as the porch light buzzed. Above him, now its third non-regulation bulb, Ethan sat down on his steps, stretched his legs out, and watched the sun melt behind the rooftops. No more fines, no more fear, and if anyone ever tried it again, they'd find this place no longer asleep,